as Sadie said, my name's Keith Keeley, and I thought I would start out tonight just by introducing myself a little bit and where I'm coming from and how that led me to the questions and the conversations that I've been having with farmers. As this says, I'll be talking about Kickapoo farmwoods tonight and some of the ways that those farmwoods tell us about what life is like here, which all of you know well. And so I hope that when I'm done, we'll have some time too for some discussion about your own stories about farmwoods. So my story begins further down the Kickapoo River, down by Gaze Mills. One of the main tributaries of the Kickapoo down there is called Tanner Creek. And I grew up down there. My folks rented out our farm, so I spent time working on neighbors' farms and picking potatoes and pulling weeds. And well, my wife tells me that it's actually called digging potatoes, but I think that's a slight vernacular difference in this part of the valley. But in any case, my dad was working at Organic Valley too, and so I got to learn some about what that was all about and wondering why all the farms weren't organic if it was so great. And that kind of wanting to understand why farmers do what they do has stuck with me ever since. So I went off to college and wasn't on farms then, but spent a lot of time in the woods when I was studying biology. And then I finished college and needed a job, so I went back to working on farms. And as I was picking more potatoes and pulling more weeds, started to realize why maybe all this work, not all farms are organic. And started to realize too that maybe 20 years from now, even though this is great now, I won't want to be doing this. So I decided to go back to school and see if I could learn something in Madison that would be of use to the farmers here. And I guess that's still to be determined, but at the university I got connected with a group called the Driftless Forest Network. And it's this coalition of local organizations and state and national groups all working together to try to figure out how can we best support landowners with forests and help them take care of their woods. But they weren't doing a lot with farmers, so I suggested I go talk to farmers and learn more about what do farmers in particular need in terms of information and support in terms of taking care of their woods. So that's what I've been doing, and like Sadie said, I've been supported by the Newsom Fund. Newsom was a lumber baron, you might say, in this valley, and his family as well, been very gracious with their money to help research to figure out what are ways that we can improve the livelihoods of people in the valley here and also the health of the forest here. So, so I set off and I've interviewed 24 farmers altogether now. I'm not going to tell you about all 20 of those farmers because we'd be here all night. And I chose to do interviews because I wanted to talk with people face to face about what do the woods mean to them. And phone interviews and mailed surveys don't capture that very well. And so I thought telling you just a couple of stories would help convey some of that sense of the farmer stories as well too. So I hope you'll go away tonight and you'll have a better understanding of what are some of the many considerations that farmers have when it comes to figuring out what to do with the woods that are a part of most of the farms in the Kickapoo Valley area here. And then, like I said, we can have some discussion. So I'm going to get my clicker here. Got all kinds of fancy technology in the valley these days, I tell you. Oh yeah, that's right. I'm learning. Okay. So the first farmer I want to tell you about is Joe, and he's a crop farmer primarily. Runs about 600 acres, most of which is two farms that he purchased recently. And a lot of that purchase was made possible, I came to learn, by a large timber sale that he did from his home farm. So I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. When I arrived at Joe's farm, he invited me to hop on one of his four-wheelers, and so we buzzed up his hill road, and he took me for a walk through his woods. We stopped in a clearing on the grassy edge of his cornfield before we got into the woods, and right away, as if he was embarrassed about the field, he told me, I haven't been able to get much done on this farm since I bought these other 2 farms. And he said the last one is over 300 acres and all tillable. So that takes up a little of my time, especially when I'm still working for the county. Joe was a busy guy. So we climbed through some brambles to get into the woods that ringed his field. And then once we were into the woods, Joe immediately started pointing out the nice timber trees. And I didn't take a lot of photos when I was doing my research just because I was focused at the... Oh, too much. There we go. I was focused on talking with the farmer, just like I'm trying to focus on talking with you. But he said, there's 1 or 2 real big walnut up here that we left. We didn't want to wreck all the ones around them when they came down. And Joe had harvested 170 walnut trees a few years previously when the price of walnut was quite high. It's still up there. And you can see kind of from this comment that his goal about, just left 1 or 2 behind was to take all the mature trees that had good timber sale value. And Joe explained to me that he worked with his cousin Mike to do the harvest. He said, we kind of do it ourselves. He showed me which ones to pick out, and he and I cut them. So Joe had no reason to work with a professional logger or forester. As he saw it, he and his cousin had the equipment and the knowledge that they needed to do the harvest. And so I asked him how did he decide it was time to do a timber harvest. And he said, well, walnut prices were pretty good, and I thought we ought to take a look at it. So I asked, did you start right out working with Mike, or were there other folks that you talked to? He said, nope, I just talked with Mike. He's my relative, so you can trust him, I suggested. He said, well, this is my next slide. He said, well, they always tell me there ain't a logger that you can trust. Mike's about the only straight one. Believe me, it's on the next slide. Yeah, we might need the tech crew up here. There we go. So, so we walked a little bit more after Mike said this, kept walking through the woods. And then as if saying it, he wasn't sure if he could trust me for sure. Maybe he was telling me too much. He said, so I didn't know what you were looking for, I guess. And I said, I'm just looking for the story of how your woods fit into your farm. And I guess I'm getting it. He said, well, we do a little hunting, but I'm a crop farmer, I guess. So I'd make more money if this were cropland. But the woods make you money too. You just got to take care of it. I said, oh, so what kind of things do you do to take care of it? I asked. He said, oh, we pasture it. And he laughed when he said that. He said, let Mother Nature take her course. But like Mike says, if you get rid of some of these smaller trees, the bigger ones will actually do better. I ain't got that done yet. Like I said, Joe is a pretty busy guy. So about the pasturing, he explained the area where we were walking, the cows only get to in the fall after he's harvested the crops. Just because of the fences, then the cows can get through that area and get to the woods. And I asked him, we hadn't gotten to the other part of the woods yet, I asked him if he sees much difference in the area where the cows are only pastured part of the year and the area where they're pastured continuously. And he said, oh yeah, I'll show you. We come out of this stuff and get back to the part where the cows are, and it's a night and day difference. You'll be shocked. I'll show you what the cows do. I'm sorry, you can't read this very well, but it's what I just said. The part where the cows are, it's a night and day difference. I'll show you what the cows do. You'll be shocked. Like I said, we weren't to that part of the woods yet, so I won't tell you about it either just yet. We'll get there. But as we walked further through this part of the woods, he pointed out other ways that they use the woods. He pointed to a horse trail that they use. Mostly he said his mom goes on trail rides there. He pointed at a dead elm that was destined for the wood stove. There's a stand of poplar where they'd cut from to build a shed a few years back. And we talked about hunting deer and mushrooms. It turned out he'd even planted some ginseng a few years back, though he said he hadn't been back since to check on it, so he didn't know how that was going. And every once in a while, we'd get by a big tree, and he'd put his arms as far around it as he could. And I wasn't quite sure what he was doing, because Joe didn't really seem like the tree hugger type, if you know what I mean. But I asked him. He turned out he was checking on the growth of the tree to see if it was ready for harvest. And the irony of this wasn't lost on him. He joked. He said, as he was hugging one, he said, "You're supposed to save it for the state park." So I asked, "Are you going to put a state park in here?" He said, "I doubt that. This here is my own stomping ground, and unless I run into a whole bunch of money," he said. And he asked me, "You going to buy a lottery ticket for Wednesday? The jackpot's up to $200 million." And I told him a story of my own uncle who won the lottery, and they flew him out to Vegas and put him on a game show, and he won $100,000. And Joe said, "Ain't nothing wrong with that." And I tell you that about the lottery because that's kind of the way that the woods can seem for a lot of farmers. The timber markets go up and down, they fluctuate wildly, and the timber value of trees can be lost in an instant. If you have a big storm or some disease or pests come through. So with the way that Joe was hugging trees to see if they were ready to go, I asked him if he was harvesting trees every few years. He said, "Well, how about I bought the farm from Dad in '94, and 3 years ago was the first cut." He said, "My dad had a stroke when he was 42, so he pretty much kept things cut to keep the farm, which is why I really didn't do any cutting after I bought the farm." And he said, "I think the trees were bigger when I was a kid, before it got logged." And then he thought back and said, "Well, actually, Grandma and Grandpa were dairy farmers here, and they pretty much paid for the farm with logs." So what Joe said there shows a couple things. It shows how the woods were important for keeping the farm in the family, and for Joe, actually expanding the farm. It also points to a pretty common phenomenon with farm woods, which is called high grading. And that's a forestry term, and so I'll explain it a little bit here because it's kind of an important thing to understand what's going on with farm woods. High grading is when you go in and you're logging and you take all of the high grade timber out, and you leave behind tree species that aren't valuable for timber and also individual trees that aren't valuable for timber. And so when that's done over generation, it changes the forest over time. So high grading, in shorthand, a lot of people say it means take the best and leave the rest. And so from an economical or a production standpoint, it means you're going to have less valuable trees in your forest over time. And to work with the forest to bring it back to production when that has happened takes a lot of time and effort. And so, especially given the kind of lottery perceptions that I talked about, it's a tough sell for a lot of farmers to go and do all that work. And that makes uses like grazing more attractive to farmers, and I'll talk about that soon. The other thing with high grading is, from an ecological point of view, it can mean a couple of different things for the forest. Sometimes the valuable trees for timber are also the valuable trees for wildlife, like oak trees, for example. The acorns and the habitat that oak provide are important for a lot of wildlife, and they're also important timber. So high grading might change a forest over to other tree species that aren't as valuable for a lot of wildlife. But on the other hand, high grading might leave behind old trees that are called snags, that are maybe hollow or crooked, and those can provide important habitat for wildlife as well. So depending on just what the history of the forest, it can mean different things. So for example of these snag trees, as we were walking along, Joe pointed to a big old oak tree in the forest. He said, "This big oak with the double trunk on it, it's been big as long as I can remember." You can tell he's been there a long, long time. And the way the branches were spreading out from down on the trunk, Joe and I talked about how that showed that that tree probably grew up out in the open. Because a lot of trees, especially oak, when there's not other trees around, they'll grow out to get to the light instead of growing up. So this tree in this photo here, this is not on Joe's farm, but you can kind of see how a lot of the limbs are going almost horizontal. And then some of these lower limbs, as other trees have grown up around it, have actually died off. So this is a tree that probably when it was younger didn't have many other trees growing around it. And you can see that as you drive around here too, a lot of trees like that. Or if you're out in your woods, you might have big old oak trees with lower limbs that are dead on them. And that shows that this forest was probably in the past more like a savanna, which is a term for an open oak type of woods where there's actually a lot of grasses and brambles and other shrubs in between it. And I had a lot of old-timer farmers I talked to tell me that they used to burn the woods off every spring. And we could talk a lot about fire, but one of the things that did was keep these areas open, and the big old oaks that had thick bark could withstand these little grass fires. So that, along with grazing, a lot of times it was sheep too, and sheep tend to browse a lot on the woody stuff more than cattle too. So in Joe's lifetime though, fire and sheep probably weren't on that hillside at all. So the area around the oak had grown up to these younger trees. So I want to show you a photo from another farm here, and this photo on the left is from, it's kind of washed out on the projector here, but you can see even up in this upper part here where the trees have sort of were more sparse in 1939. And then this is from 2011 here, and you can see how a lot of that has filled in. And this photo was taken in on the, it'd be your right, was taken in the wintertime. And so even in the wintertime when the foliage is off of most of the trees, you can see that the trees have filled in most of that. And if you look at these old photos, you can see that's the case with a lot of parts of the valley. And there's actually research going on right now down in Hogsback Prairie, which is down by Steuben, where they're using grazing to see if that might be a way to manage the prairies. But on an actual working farm, using grazing to maintain a woodland gets pretty complicated quickly, as we'll talk about here. So Joe and I, back to the woods here with Joe, we crossed a fence and walked to a short distance, and we got into the part of the woods where the cattle had been continuously. And Joe said, this whole area has been pastured hard because the old dairy cows used to run in here. He said, this here is what I call intense pastured, and the multiflora rose bushes are taking over, and they're killing everything off, killing the grass, they're just killing everything. And he described to me how he got into a cost share program with the government, and they paid half of, it's about $1,000 that he spent on spray, and he said he had them all killed, but then he bought these other farms, and it got away from him, and they all came back, and so that really angered him. And he bought a dozer, and he said that's what he bought it for, was he was going to clean house with that. And he said, let's face it, these things were brought in and used for fence, and now they're nothing but a disaster. And some of you may know this history. A lot of the farmers that I did were quick to point out to me that this was something that the government brought in. And here, I dug into the journals a little bit here. This is from 1946, the Journal of Wildlife Management. And this is an author from the U.S. Soil Conservation Service, now known as the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And this was an article promoting the use of multiflora rose as a farm hedge, as a living fence. And they planted it up through the 70s. So in the history of great ideas, you won't find this one. And as many of you who have land around here can tell you, once this stuff gets going, it really becomes a problem. And when I asked Joe, one of the questions I'd ask farmers is, what would you do differently with your woods if you had all the time and money in the world? And Joe said to me, well, I'd probably be out in the woods all the time. I really would. I'd be out there pissing around doing something. Nothing else, cutting firewood, cleaning up the downfalls, maybe even cutting some of them small elms out of there. Maybe if I had all this multiflora rose killed too, he said. A couple years ago, I had it all killed, and it aggravates you, but what can you do about it? So that sort of points to, if you had all the time in the world, you'd go kill some of this multiflora rose, just how high it is on his list of problems. And then in that comment too was also dealing with some of those small elm that were coming up. So that's again the impact of high grading over many generations and trying to find the time to do that work to bring the forest back. time and energy and money are limited on a lot of farms. So dealing with multiple rows and trying to bring woods back, it's a difficult thing. Now, I should note that, and they're connected too, that Joe told me, and other farmers too, he was concerned about taking too much of the elm and that kind of things out, because then with more light getting through the canopy, he was afraid the multiflora rows would come up even faster, even stronger. So this is how it gets tangled up, trying to think about how to use grazing in the woods on a farm. So there is a disease that's coming through, and there's research going on with it called rosette disease that does have an impact on the multiflora rows. It hasn't become widespread here yet, but we'll see in a few years down the road if it's still at the top of farmers' list of problems with their woods. Another thing I pointed out to Joe as we were going through this woods that had been pastured continuously is that there weren't many tree seedlings coming up. And Joe recognized this, and he was pretty quick to come back and say, well, you guys from the university, you ought to get a grip on this recreational land so farmers don't pasture it. Because right now, honest to God, in the state of Wisconsin, if you can pasture someplace, you're going to pasture it because it's more than, well, I think it's about $100 assessed value versus $1,000, really. And that's a problem when it comes to paying taxes. So let's talk a little bit about what Joe's talking about there. Some of you are probably well acquainted with what he's referring to here, but there's a program or policy in Wisconsin called Ag Use Property Tax Assessment. And what that means, if you'll hang with me as we talk about taxes here, some people love to talk about taxes, other people their eyes kind of glaze over, but what it means basically is if you're using land for agriculture, it's assessed for taxation according to the money that you can get back, the return you can get from that agricultural use. Whereas other land is taxed according to the real estate market rate. So that assessment, it can vary quite dramatically. And the taxes for low-grade pasture land, you're not expected to get much return from that. So they're going to be much lower than if you're taxed according to what you can get if you sell the land. And that being taxed according to what you can get if you sell the land is what a lot of people call recreational land. And in the tax rolls, which I'll show you in a second here, it's actually called productive forest land if it's woods. So the words get kind of thrown around here. But basically, this policy of ag use taxation came about because farmers were getting taxed through the roof as property values skyrocketed, especially around cities where there's development pressure. So they put this in so that farmers wouldn't have to sell the farm because of high property taxes, which sounds great, but around here it means basically that if farmers fence and pasture their woods, they get a lot lower taxes. And Joe was explaining this to me. So let me show you a couple tax rolls that I pulled out here. And this was, this is down in Crawford County now. I went down on the website where they have all the land parcels, and I literally just picked the first two land parcels that looked like they were mostly woods. These are 240s here. And this one on the left happened to be assessed according to agriculture. You can see down here, this is the actual tax roll. Class 14 means it's ag. And you can see the total taxes is $65 here. And 16 is productive forest land. That's what a lot of people call recreation. And you can see the total taxes down here, $2,100 there. So Joe was actually underestimating it when he said it was 100 versus 1,000. So you can see it's a pretty strong incentive here to fence the woods if you can. Now, I asked Joe if he thought about the managed forest law program, which is another way that a lot of people lower their taxes on their woods. And he wasn't sure what I was talking about at first, but then when I explained that that's the program where you work with a forester and you come up with a plan for what to harvest and when, and he said, yeah, but then they cut into my paycheck. When the logger comes in and takes 30–40%, and then the state takes another 15%, there ain't much left out of the pot. And the other thing was they had two classifications to cheapen it. One was you could open it up for hunting and then you pay a little less, and the other was you keep control of the hunting rights and you pay a little more. And he said, well, I wouldn't do neither one because I'll pasture it before I ever do that. So then there's the fact that the managed forest law is managed by the DNR, and Joe didn't really want to deal with the DNR. Like a lot of farmers, he wasn't too fond of the DNR. he said. They'll come after you for having noxious weeds, and he described the giant ragweed growing up on the land that the DNR had bought down by one of his farms, and the fact that the DNR wasn't paying much taxes on that land that they bought up either, that irked him too. So anyway, that's some of the things that were going on in Joe's mind. And that's what I'm trying to share with you. And that's not the whole conversation that I had with Joe, but it brings up some of the strong themes and things that I heard from other farmers too. Big issues like the quality of life uses with the woods, things like firewood and deer hunting. Timber sales have been important for keeping the farm in the family, and for Joe expanding the farm. So he feels like he can make a living at it. And then that management for timber has been limited by a number of things. That kind of lottery attitude I talked about, and then the historical high grading of the woods that have make it difficult to bring back into production. And then the property taxes too, that along with the uncertainty of the return from timber have made pasturing the cattle seem like a better idea. And then he doesn't have to work with the DNR either. So talking about attitudes towards the DNR is as good a place as any to go on to talk about the next farmer. A conversation with Dennis, the dairy farmer. So Dennis, a fourth generation dairy farmer, his farm was only a few miles away from Joe's. It was on a ridge top that literally overlooks the Mississippi. So this is technically out of the Kickapoo Valley, but part of the same community. So Joe, whereas Joe spoke pretty quickly and freely, Dennis was a pretty terse fellow, and he was pretty serious and he didn't laugh much, but we still had a good conversation sitting at his kitchen table, looking out the window at his barn and the pasture and the woods and the valley below it. And he told me too he was not real fond of the DNR. He said, I just follow the rules. And he also told me about timber harvest he did, where the county forester came out and gave him a little bit of guidance. And then he said, I think we did a good job with the county forester, but describing the managed forest law program, he said, I don't think the state should get a cut of the logging checks. He was trying to get me into a program, and I wouldn't do it because they got a percentage of the harvest. And you kind of lose control of your forest. I don't think I could have pastured my woods either. The woods are part of my feed for the cattle in the summer when we rotate them. So here you can see Dennis is thinking some of the same things as Joe. Doesn't want the percentage taken from his sale. He wants control of when and what to harvest, and he wants to be able to pasture his woods. But the other thing here is that he did call the county forester out to take a look at his woods with him. And that was something I heard from other farmers too, that they'd call him the county forester, and even though they technically work for the DNR, they kind of separated that thing. And so that shows a couple of things to me, that a lot of times farmers trust county level officials more than the state officials from the DNR. And it also shows that relationships with individual agents can be separated from attitudes towards the agency as a whole. And then it also shows that that sort of unbiased information that foresters are providing is something that's valuable to farmers. So a couple things to keep in mind there about attitudes towards the DNR and county foresters. So from that, let's move to attitudes towards, Joe's attitudes towards the woods in general. And I asked him, how would his farm be different if it didn't have woods on it? And he said, well, it's nice to be able to look out the barn door and look down across the ridge and into the woods and see deer or turkeys or anything. And then he said, without the woods, it'd probably be hotter, be a lot of erosion, wouldn't be no shade, wouldn't have the wildlife that we had if there wasn't any woods. It would definitely be different. So you can see the photo I selected of a farm that doesn't have any woods here. Pretty dismal. You can see my own bias here too, I guess. But you can see that Dennis values the woods for a variety of different reasons. And I should mention too that Joe also talked about the value of the woods for controlling erosion on steep hillsides and moderating some of the local climate and the storms. So we've seen some of that recently here. So I showed Dennis an aerial photo that I printed off of the area around his farm. And he traced out his farm on the photo with a pencil, and then he showed me that the northern part of the farm might actually cut off on the photo. And he explained to me that this was an area where they went in and did a harvest and clear cut it in the 90s. He said, I went in and cut a chunk of trees down, and I replanted walnut and oaks and some maples. Not a lot, because there was a lot of young volunteer stuff coming. We try to keep box elder down, which is a battle. Then we've been planting a few trees each year and what we think needs to be done. The planting in the north, it looks real good. We've actually pruned the trees once, and in a few more years it'll look like a decent woods. Now, at one time to me, clear cutting sounded to me like a greedy way to destroy your woods. But if you think about it, if you compare this clear cutting and then replanting and taking care of the volunteers to going in and high grading, Dennis could have done that. He could have gone in and just cut the valuable trees out. And it probably would have been less work. And that would be high grading, basically. But then he would have been left with what's left over. And oak seedlings, in particular, need open sunlight to really grow. They just don't do well in the shade. They're not shade tolerant. And so for that very reason, oaks have been in decline in southwest Wisconsin for quite a number of years. And they say that about 30% more oak are taken each year than are replaced. And they're replaced instead by more shade tolerant species like maple and basswood and the box elder that Dennis said he was battling here. Now, Dennis didn't explain all this to me. When I asked him what his motivation was for planting after this clear cut, he simply said to me, replace what I took. Like I said, he was a man of few words. But Dennis really did have a caretaker attitude towards his woods. He described to me how he would go out and walk his fences to check and see if there were trees down on them, or looking to see if a cow had a calf in the woods. And he said he was always checking the trees to see what was going on with them and if there's any diseases or, like I say, tops down, seeing if they were mature and getting ready for a harvest. And that caretaker attitude showed in the way that he intensively manages his pasturing too. His herd's grazing. He rotates his cattle into different paddocks to let the grass in the pastures rest and recover in between time. And you may wonder, well, what does that have to do with the woods? Well, like Joe, Dennis grazes his woods, but he does it in kind of a different way than Joe. And so I told Dennis, a lot of foresters will tell you that one of the worst things you can do for your woods is put cattle in there. And Dennis told me flat out, I would disagree with that. He said about putting his cattle in the woods, he said we rotate them around. It gives the pastures a break, especially the woods. And he talked about how, especially last year in the drought, when a lot of the grass in the pastures were dead, the only place to get any forage was in the woods. And that shade that's in the wood was really important. And he also said there's forage out there. Our woods isn't real thick, the stuff is brushy, there's grasses and stuff growing up under the trees. So that shows too that Dennis may have this same type of woodland, an open oak woodland, where there's more sunlight getting through. And it's not clear whether Dennis was thinking about this, but for this type of woods, that may actually be helping to maintain it. But that's a tough call to make. So it's just important to remember that for Dennis, grazing the woods was part of keeping his herd healthy. And that he's also rotating them and to try to minimize the damage that the cattle are doing to his woods. He also described how he tries to keep them from congregating around one tree. He said, if we can help it, we don't want them to do root damage and compacting the soil around the trees. And he thought that the manure from the cattle might actually help the trees some too. Dennis claimed to me that property taxes have nothing to do with why he pastures in his woods. Like Joe, Dennis was also battling multiflora rows on his property. And I asked him to, what he would do. Oh, I'm going to skip over this slide. This is about some of the other trees that Dennis was controlling, trying to keep down to some degree on his farm, the elm and the box elder and the red cedar here. So when I asked Dennis what he would do if he had unlimited time and money, he said he'd try to get a handle on this honeysuckle and multiflora rose. He said too, it's choking stuff out. Nothing grows underneath. So again, near the top of the list here for Dennis. And Dennis is organic too, so he is not spraying these things to keep them down like a lot of conventional farms are. He says that's all power saw work out in the woods. He can clip, he can mow in the pasture some, but he's told me he thought these were basically worthless plants. And so if you're not familiar, this is honeysuckle. There are native varieties of honeysuckle, but they look a little bit different and they're pretty rare. And this is the multiflora rose here on the right. So when I asked another farmer that question about what would you do different with your woods if you had unlimited time and money, he told me he might find a shady spot and a cold drink, but but some people like to battle multiflora rose too, I guess. So something to think about with these weeds, basically, invasive plants, is that it really takes the cooperation of neighbors because you can battle them all day on your property, but if you've got neighbors around you that are not doing that, then it's going to keep coming back strong. I mean, the birds eat the berries for both of these. Farmers talk about how they sit on the fence post or the fence and they just drop seeds there all day long. So, and Dennis talked too about how they should come up with some kind of cost share or incentive program to take out the honeysuckle, especially. And Dennis Joe, the other farmer, talked about how he did that, and you could do that with honeysuckle too, but a lot of those programs cost share for spray too, so they're not as useful for organic farmers. And a lot of farmers don't take advantage of that. So there's probably improvements to be made there on ways that we work with farmers on controlling these things and on working with the neighbors in the area too, if it's really going to be effective. Another thing I just want to mention in terms of stuff that's overrunning the woods, and this is actually a native species, and it's an animal. I don't know if any of you have any guesses. It's not just a bad guy though. For a lot of farmers, it's a good guy and a bad guy. And talking about the white-tailed deer here, which a lot of farmers really enjoy their woods because that's where the deer hang out. But a lot of farmers will also tell you how much crop damage they get from the deer. So it's kind of a two-edged sword there with the deer. A lot of farmers like to have them, but cattle aren't the only ones that can be hard on the woods. Just like these species, they came from Asia, and so they don't have their major predators and to take care of them here. The same goes with the deer. We've kind of chased the predators away, and so the deer, in many cases, are unchecked. So the other thing that's kind of taken over the woods unchecked is, and Dennis talked to me a lot about this. This was his favorite topic, in fact, was the way the neighborhood's changing, the people, actually. And like I said, he's on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi, so this is a shot from nearby his farm, and if you've got a good view of this, you can see there's half a dozen, 8, 10 little homesteads that have popped up here. And Dennis talked about a lot of things that really were a pain in the ass for him, is the way he put it, about these neighbors, from the way that they don't put up fences, they don't keep up fences, the way everybody buys a little piece of land and they want to get it surveyed, and then you can't really move fences that easy, so it ends up wasting their money and his time. And then he takes his cows across the road, and the neighbors get the manure on their car and they get angry. And deer hunting, I suppose I should sign in too, I guess. But when he's deer hunting, he's got to worry now about shooting into the neighbor's yard. Neighbors want to rent out their land, but they've got a farm that they split up, so it's little plots, and they're planting little orchards here and there without using common sense, so you got to back out. And then he described one neighbor that just cut everything in their section, and they didn't plant anything back. because he said they paid too much for the land and then they built an expensive home. Now they can't afford the taxes, and now all they got is a brush pile, and it's going to get taken over by multiflora rows because the birds and the turkeys are going to carry that in. Now this was a very, very frustrating thing for Dennis. And these conflicts between farmers and newcomers are not uncommon. I'm sure a lot of you here have your own stories about this sort of thing. But a lot of times these conflicts don't come to a head. They don't boil over. They just kind of simmer, you know. And that kind of simmering conflict might not seem like a big deal, but when we're talking about cooperating on things, it really gets in the way. And there's a lot of ways that this cooperation, a lot of forms it might take. It might be, like I talked about, the different weed species cooperating on removing them. It might be cooperating on forming agreements about who's going to maintain the fence and at what cost. Or it might be cooperation in the political arena and figuring out the kind of policy that's going to make property taxes fair, or that's going to support farmers as they're doing conservation work in their woods. And then beyond the sort of just making this the kind of community we all want to live in, there's the larger implications of how we live here. And that could be the disappearing oak savanna ecosystems I talk about. It could be the carbon that's sequestered by the trees in the woods here and its effect on the climate. It could be the over-nutrified farm runoff that's going down into the Gulf of Mexico, and we've got the largest dead zone in history there now, the size of New Jersey. So a lot of farmers I talk to feel like the woods will abide. They're going to stick around, and I agree. But the kind of the woods that we've got and what's in them, their health, and their value to us is going to be determined by what we do and what we don't do with the woods. So my hope with sharing some of Joe and Dennis's stories here is that you'll have a better understanding of what farmers are grappling with, what their goals are when it comes to managing their woods. And I hope that this understanding will help us do a little bit more of this cooperating and work together towards our shared goals of a healthy valley with healthy woods and healthy farms. So thanks again to the folks here at KVR. Thanks to the Newsom Fund for making the research possible and my education. Thanks to my family for supporting me. Thanks to the Driftless Forest Network for guiding me. And thanks to all the farmers who took the time to sit down with me and share their stories with me. Thanks to all of you for listening. I think I have a slide for that too. There we go. Thank you. Now let's talk. So yeah, if you need to go, please do. But I hope that those of you who can will stick around and share some of your own stories or questions. Yeah, go ahead here.
Right off the bat, I want to get back to the dramatic difference between the pastured and unpastured, or heavily pastured and not so pastured woodland areas that Joe had.
Yeah.
He said, a big dramatic difference, I'll show you. Can you?
Yeah, I didn't have a photo of it. Yeah. So, well, so I talked about some of it, right? So the multiflora rose was everywhere. For example, there wasn't much. Yeah. Yeah. This is my education, right? So I'm learning to take pictures. Where you go. Yeah, and many of you have seen the way multiflora rose takes over. If you haven't, keep an eye out for it. It just finished blooming, but you'll see it, sometime in May. I guess it is usually, depending on the spring. White flowers, bushes that fill the pasture. If you're up close to it, it's got a hooked barb, so you can tell it different from the other brambles that way. So that was one thing. A lot of gooseberry in the area where he was pasturing hard. Not much for tree seedlings. Virtually no herbs, the herbaceous layer, the little plants and wildflowers on the forest floor. And there was some of that stuff. There were some of those kind of wildflower plants in the other area. Saw some seedlings coming up. Yeah, something more like this, yeah. So that's kind of the dramatic difference here. Yeah, does anybody else have experience with that?
If that's just multiflora rose.
Well, that's not the only thing that was there. I mean, and the cows will eat it if they get hungry enough. So that's something that I heard from some farmers. Having cows in there would actually help keep down the multiflora rows. And so I think there are different thresholds where if it gets to a certain level, just having something in there to trample it down some.
What about goats?
I talked to...
the paper about this trend toward using goats.
Yep, and that's what they're doing down by Steuben at the Hogsback Prairie.
Handle the wildflower road.
Yeah, it'll eat it. And I said that to some farmers. I said, well, have you thought about goats? And that went over like a lead balloon. I mean, yeah, right. Said if you want to come out here and chase those goats around, basically. Yeah.
Horses is funny because I don't know there's like multiflora roads up here.
Yeah, it's in patches. It really depends where it's been planted. Yeah. Go ahead.
In your research, have you run into the idea of clear cutting being sort of an analog for natural disturbance regimes in certain areas?
Yeah, that's the way us folks in Madison talk about it. And like I said, my thinking has evolved about that. Growing up, reading, books about clear cutting and that kind of thing. It just seems like the worst kind of thing. The woods disappear, but natural disturbance. Fires, wind blows, things that, or if oak is real dense. Yeah, I mean, oak needs a disturbance basically to get started. You'll see stands of red oak that are all even aged basically, which means all the trees are basically about the same age. And that's because they basically all get started at the same time.
But isn't that I used to hear that was for tie production, tie logs. Clear cutting would produce more tie logs.
Right. Right, so that would be from the what do you want to get out of it side of it. But what I've been learning about is, well, then if you want to actually get oak back after you harvest oak, it basically needs to be clear cut so there's enough sunlight for the oak seedlings that come back. And young oak actually are pretty good at resprouting from their stumps too. Yep, yep. So.
What about walnut? Is it resprout?
What about walnut? I don't know. Anybody notice a walnut resprout? I've never heard of it. Does it? You can't kill them. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Walnut's one of these trees that, different farmers, some of them really like having the walnut. Some of them will tell you that, I don't know why they're promoting walnut, because it's certainly not native to around here. And its range is kind of spotty, I think. I think some of this upper Kickapoo Valley, there hasn't been a lot of walnut historically. But if you get down closer to the Mississippi, there are what I believe are native stands of walnut. So for people who are interested in planting, what's here naturally, then that's something to consider. Other folks, walnut tends to be a higher value log, and so they want to put that in when they're planting. Yeah?
I've come to realize how to get rid of box elder. I just wondered if you had some tips.
On getting rid of box elder? Well,
What do you recommend getting rid of box elder?
from the farmers I talked to, a lot of them would say a bulldozer and glyphosate.
The easy way is
That's the easy way
just to go
to girdle them, yeah.
to die back.
But I was told if you cut them in August, about 2 or 3 feet tall, they'll die off. And I did it once and it worked perfect.
Uh-huh.
The other time I did it didn't work, so I don't quite know what the difference was. But it was amazing. I cut them about this high, and sure enough, I was in them.
Yeah.
Every other time I cut them, they grow back.
Uh-huh.
Gotta cut them high enough.
Huh. Yeah, one of the things that I didn't talk a lot about, but is there's different efforts to try to find a market for some of these low value trees like box elder and elm. And who knows whether that'll ever come, because there's so much of it. But one of the things I've heard talk about is like we have our consumer co-ops that come around and deliver natural gas to the tanks in our backyards if we don't heat with wood. Well, a lot of the modern chip stoves or pellet stoves, you could have a hopper in your backyard, basically right where your natural gas tank is. And that would provide at least something that we could do with some of this timber. I mean, we've got so much firewood in this valley. Anybody who lives here knows that there's more of that than we need. So that could be something where like the farmers say, get out and take out some of those elm or the box elder. If there was something to actually do with them, there'd be more motivation to do it.
And are they doing any studies about like high grading versus TSI, timber stand improvement, and selective harvesting? Is there any long-term studies going on about their economic returns?
Yeah, well, one important example is up in the Menominee County. And some of you may be familiar with that, where they're on a, instead of a 30 or 80 year rotation, they're on a couple hundred, 300 year rotation. And they've actually been harvesting for, since they got legal control of the land for over 100 years. And they've got more standing board feet in their woods now than they did then. And they've harvested, millions of, I don't know how many millions of board feet off it since then. So they're doing a continuous stand, whereas if we're managing for oak and we're looking to clear, oak resprouts better when it's younger. So, I don't know if there's an easy answer to that one, to what's the sort of long-term ecological effects of these different forestry. Forestry is a pretty young science, There's understanding the way that the woods are and have been through history, but then understanding how we're going to manage them for production. We've only been trying to do that scientifically for a little over 100 years.
Because isn't that one of the big challenges all of us have, is being able to afford timber stand improvement?
Yeah.
And having a use for the woods that you get out of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Is the reserve, are you all involved in a biomass study of some sort?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's hopeful.
What was that word?
So biomass is the word a lot of people use for, things that grow, basically, but don't have value as timber. So they're going to use it for energy or heat or something like that. Yeah, there's a study going on right now. It's the Economic Planning Commission for the Mississippi Valley region partnering with the city of Lafarge, and they're trying to look at what are possible markets for this low-grade timber. So stay tuned. Maybe we'll have something to do with those box elders soon. Although I should say, one thing a lot of farmers have figured out to do with them is these outdoor wood boilers can take box elder logs, whereas your indoor wood furnace doesn't burn box elder very well. And those have got their benefits. They have also got their drawbacks. They can put out a lot of smoke and smell. They're not real efficient. But they certainly are more convenient and less fire damage in the house for a lot of people. So
Can you use like box elder and other garbage trees to make stove pellets? I thought you had to have a high quality wood.
if you're looking for markets for a higher quality wood pellet, yes, to get a consistent quality, you do need that. But there are markets for low grade pellets too. And yeah. So that's stretching the area of my expertise, but I'm learning about it because it turns out, what's there a market for is not too surprisingly a lot of what's important to farmers when they're making decisions about what to do with their land. Though, as I hope I've talked about, markets are not the only thing that farmers are thinking about. There are a lot of quality of life issues too when it comes to the woods especially. Go ahead.
A friend of mine who raised those Highland cattle and shaggy cattle, he was real big on rotational grazing for everything. He said it keeps your grass healthy. And I'm not sure exactly what his position was for grazing the woods. And when he said, any kind of vegetation was healthier to be, grazed but carefully rotated. So I wasn't sure about it. I wanted your position on grazing the woods.
Yeah, well.
How do you feel about that? I'm not sure what you were saying.
I was careful not to give you too much of my own thought there, just tell you the farmer story. So as hopefully I described, I think that it's not so much as if you're grazing the woods or if you're not. It can be a matter of how you're going about it. What type of woods that you have. What type of animals are you putting in there? What's the timing of when you're putting them in there? The intensity, the stocking rate. So I think that those are important things that we don't have a lot of research about. And so hopefully some of this research that they're doing with goats in the prairie will continue to evolve a little more to stuff that farmers can actually do on their farms and answer some of those questions about, because I described the difference between the taxes there. And as long as we have that policy, I think it's unreasonable to expect that farmers are going to just stop grazing their woods. So then the question is, well, if we're going to do it, what's a way that it's going to be economically feasible to keep those fences up, but also it's going to keep the woods healthy too. So that's the way I think about it.
Of course, we here in the Kickapoo area, we're having less and less cattle.
Mm-hmm.
So whether or not to graze the woods doesn't become a problem.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, yeah, there's more.
So the small farms are going, and along with that, the cattle, and
Yeah.
so
There-
we have a lot of woods that have no opportunity to be pastured.
Yeah, that's true. I didn't talk about that dynamic. I could have talked about it in this last slide, talking about, the trend line is definitely big farms and small parcels of people living on land. And you're right, the small farms are going, but they're not gone. There's actually still a fair number of smaller, medium-sized farms in the valley. And for my part, I think it's still important to learn about what are these kind of farms going to do. And the big fish, the big farms, I tried to get a hold of some of these big farms, big dairies and cash grain farms, and they just didn't have time for me, basically. And so I have to assume that it's basically the same with the woods. And so any kind of efforts that we're doing to help promote and keep healthy, small, medium-sized farms going, I think is going to be for the benefit of the woods too. Because I have to imagine that those big farms, if they've got wooded acreage, and a lot of those big farms, as they're buying up land, I mean, you saw Joe said that last 300-acre farm he bought was all tillable. So a lot of the bigger farms, as they get bigger, they're trying not to add too much woods because they know the taxes are going to get them. But the woods they do have, you have to imagine that they're going to get high graded and not carefully managed unless they're an exceptional sort of farmer that really has an eye for the woods and cares about them, which those do exist. So, yeah. You, sir.
Okay, so different farmers, there's any kind of incentive, there's a question come up with them doing burns with their woods. I mean, a lot dead or some known, or just time or what variable.
Yeah. Like I say, it was mostly the old timers who told me about this, and I don't think it's widely practiced now. And the burns, they're, again, it depends on the kind of woods where the burn might actually be good for it. And people who do what they call prescribed burning now, or controlled burning as opposed to uncontrolled burning, it's a careful science. And so I would recommend, if anybody's going to do burning, talk to somebody who's done it before. Because you don't just want to light a match and say, it's good for the woods. But the one old timer, I asked him, well, why'd you stop doing the burning? And he said, oh, it's the environmentalists. And it's funny to me because some of the environmentalists that I know, they're all about prairie restoration. And so burning and cutting down trees is like their favorite thing to do. And so they said, never call me a tree hugger because I've cut down and burned more trees than you ever will. So it's how those things change. So as we keep on learning, what are we doing with this land here? It's like Aldo Leopold said, the oldest task in human history is to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. And, we are still figuring that out, I think. I think we're, hopefully we're going to be here for a while, so we might as well keep learning. What are we doing here?